Hi everybody, Mike from the Digital Media Lab. Here today we're going to finish up part 3 of our adjustment layers, brushes, and a little bit of basic masking. Let's get started. I'll go ahead and start by making sure my fill adjustment layer is on. We can see here that it's a pretty heavy-handed effect. So we're going to want to kind of go in here and start to adjust some of our opacities down quite a bit for each of these layers. And we actually, because we've created groups, we can actually adjust these opacities in two different ways. We can actually adjust the way that I'm doing here by adjusting the individual opacities for the layers themselves. And I find, by the way, that somewhere between 40 and 80% works pretty well right here. But we can also go to our adjustment layer, the folder, this grouped layer here up at the top, and simply adjust down the opacity for all three. We don't want to set this too low, but just a tiny bit helps. In general, you tend to work in Photoshop, you tend to overdo effects and things like that, and then it tends to be a good idea to bring the opacity down and kind of help them blend with the image a little bit better. I think this is looking pretty good. Now the first thing that we want to do is I want to go ahead and select my background layer. Whenever we create a new layer, it's always going to put it above our background layer, and layer order is very important as the visibility kind of goes up through here. You can always see, and you guys don't need to follow along with this, but just to illustrate my point, if I swap my adjustments and fill layers, it changes how these layers interact with each other, and you can see here that my image changes. I'm going to go ahead and adjust and drag that these layers are in the correct order, like that. Again, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my background layer is selected, and then I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to select Paste and Embedded. Just as we discussed with Illustrator and things like that, you could do place linked or place embedded. Place linked is usually preferable, as it makes sure that your file sizes don't get too big as you start to create some of your more complex files. But for the purposes of just today's exercise, we're going to use place embedded. I'll go ahead and navigate to this Unsplash image I found of some clouds. It's by Jason Blackeye. And it starts by creating a smart object. And I want to get this image quite a bit bigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag from this top corner out like that. And when I do so, I'm going to hold down my Alt key on my keyboard. I'm going to get it quite a bit bigger. I don't want any of the sky area here up at the top showing up. What I really want is these clouds. So you can adjust that somewhere so that it fits like that. I'll go ahead and click OK. Or I'll go ahead and tap the Enter key when I'm ready to commit that change. Now by default, this layer does not have a layer mask, so I'm going to create a layer mask by selecting this add a layer mask icon at the bottom of my layers palette, and by default it's going to give me a white layer mask. Let's take a minute and talk a little bit about layer masks, because they're a little bit confusing about exactly how they work. Now, a layer mask is going to hide or show a layer based on the values you set in it. In this case, the layer is completely white, so everything shows through into this layer. It's almost as though the layer mask, it doesn't do anything because it's simply showing here. But if I take my brush, and this time I'm going to use my bracket keys to increase the size of my brush. I'm going to tap those bracket keys, and I'm going to make sure that I'm painting with black, so I'm going to change my foreground and background color to the default by clicking this little icon here. It's very, very tiny at the bottom. It's toward the bottom of my tools panel here. And then if I hit my X key, I can swap the foreground and background color, and that makes sure that I have black. So the hotkeys for that would be D for default, and then X to swap your foreground and background color. Oops, I hit the wrong button, so I'll hit B to grab my brush tool. With black as my foreground color, you can see here that as I paint, I'm hiding this part of the image. If I paint too far, like if I get up too far in here and I want to kind of change things, I can swap, again, I can hit the X key to swap my foreground and background color, and then I can paint with white. So white reveals and black conceals inside of a layer mask. And we can see here down inside of this thumbnail that the layer mask. By the way, if you're for some reason not allowed to paint on here, you need to make sure that your layer mask is the active part of this layer. You can see here that it has these little brackets. So here I have the actual layer selected, and then here I have the layer mask selected. It's always a little bit confusing which one you have selected, so make sure you have your layer mask selected. I'm going to go ahead and go up to Edit Fill. And by the way, Edit Fill pretty much works like if you remember the paint bucket tool from Paint. It's basically going to just fill everything here. I'm going to go ahead and just fill everything with white, essentially just neutralizing my layer mask right here. I want to make sure that I have a fairly low hardness. So I'm going to right click anywhere on my canvas again. And then I'm going to set my hardness to 0, and I'm going to press return. And then maybe I might increase the bracket. Again, you guys should be doing this to taste. I want to go ahead and paint with black, so I'm going to press my X key to swap my foreground and background color. And then I'm going to kind of paint in here. I kind of want to hide these clouds so that they sort of are starting to blend with the image a little bit. There we go. And if I go too far, I can always kind of come back here, press my X key, and paint with white and kind of bring some of those clouds back so that I'm getting I want to make sure that I'm kind of revealing the major parts of this nebula without kind of... Another thing you can do with your layer masks, so layer masks generally can only select black and white. If I try to set a color up here, you can see that my foreground color actually just converts it to the gray value. But you can paint with gray. The easiest way to do that is to go ahead and set your foreground color to black and then to change the opacity of the brush up here at the top. So the brush itself has blend modes and opacities. I'll go ahead and adjust my opacity to about 20%. So with an opacity of 20%, I'm going to paint about 20% gray based on my foreground color. So I'm going to kind of help blend this in a little bit and bring back some of the original image. I might go ahead and swap that and maybe get a smaller brush here by pressing my bracket keys and start to kind of click in here and bring some of these clouds in as needed. And I'm clicking several times because each time I press and click, I'm applying 20% gray to that. So I want to make sure this kind of blends in here. Maybe bring some of it in here, kind of like that cloud. You'll have to kind of adjust your image and just see what works to taste. If your adjustment and fill layers, by the way, are getting in your way, you can kind of you can hide them temporarily and bring them back in your image. Anyway, go ahead and adjust your image. And feel free to pause the video if you need be. Another way that we can change our adjustment layers. So I'm going to go to my adjustment layers and select my brightness adjustment layer. Is I can actually grab my gradient tool, and you can apply a gradient to the layer mask itself. We can see here, if I hold down my Alt key and I click the layer mask, I can actually view the layer mask itself. We can see here that it gradiates from black to white. Of course, wherever it's gray, it's only partially showing through. And if I click my layer thumbnail again, it should bring me back to the normal view. Go ahead and actually reset your gradient tool, and that'll make sure that we're all on the same page. So we reset the gradient tool in the same way that we reset the brush tool by right-clicking up here and selecting Reset Tool. Then I'm going to select my radial gradient, and by default it'll be set to from foreground to background. Now that's actually the opposite gradient that we want. It actually kind of like reveals instead of hides, because right now this area in the center is getting a little bit too bright. So if I press the X key, I will swap out my gradients, and I can kind of click and drag out here. Now the gradient's going to occur wherever I drag my mouse cursor. This will create a gradient all the way to the edge of the document. This will create a gradient just from here to here. All right, so that kind of hides this area here. If I shift click my mask, I can kind of temporarily hide it, and we can see that that's kind of hiding that little center portion. It was getting a little bit too bright. I can go in here and make some adjustments. Maybe my opacity is a little bit too high. I think that this pattern is getting a little bit overbearing. We kind of want it to be a little bit more subtle. Maybe I don't quite like the hues that are coming out of here, so I can go back to my hue adjustment layer and completely change all these things. The nice thing about adjustment layers is you can completely change everything on the fly. If I want to go back here to my mask, I'm not satisfied with my mask, I can kind of make some adjustments here. Maybe I want to change the blend mode of this to like maybe a screen. Yeah, let's try screen. And maybe I want to kind of go in here and adjust my mask a little bit, making sure that the mask is selected. It is, okay. And make some adjustments to my mask there. Alright, this concludes the tutorial. Go ahead and turn this file in. Your file does not need to look exactly like mine as long as you kind of have these basic adjustment layers. So make sure you have these adjustment layers down here. Make sure your layers look roughly like mine, and this is the file that you'll turn in along with the file that you created with the brush tool.